Good morning, everyone, from windy Amsterdam. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar to launch AMEC Measurement Month. I'm Jeroen Scholten, Managing Director of Publistat, since 2000 the market leader on media monitoring and analysis in Holland. I'm also co-chair of AMEC's European chapter, and it's a great honor to launch AMEC Measurement Month 2015. This webinar is the first, but definitely not the last, event during Measurement Month. Throughout September, a series of free events will take place all around the world. The purpose of this is to educate PR professionals about the importance of measurement and evaluation of communications. Measurement Month forms part of AMEC's global education program, which aims to fill the gap between understanding the value of PR measurement and doing something about it. Today we have an expert panel standing by to bring together their views on the latest survey findings about communication measurement practices and approaches. Our facilitator is Ben Smith, founder of PR Moment, who will ask some challenging questions of the panel about what these findings mean for us. The panel is made up of me, Jeroen Scholten, Sarah Gibbons, Head of Communication Strategy at the Department of Health in the UK government, and Paul Hender, Head of Business Intelligence at Gorgana Group. Welcome, panel. I will now hand over to Paul Hender, who will briefly summarize the headline findings from AMEC and Gorgana's recent measurement survey. Paul, it's yours.
Thank you, Jeroen, and welcome everybody. So really, to frame Measurement Month, we thought it would be useful to look at some research that AMEC conducted earlier in the summer. And this is really to understand both the current usage of measurement, but also beliefs around how measurement is being used and how it should be used. Just to give you a bit of a background to the research, we based this was a survey sent to a list of more than 70,000 PR contacts. And those contacts were kindly supplied by a combination of AMEC, Gorgana, Booz Allen, Hamilton, and Ketchum. And we distributed the questionnaire via email, by newsletters, and through social media engagement. The research is now based on 587 respondents to that larger list. And within those almost 600 respondents, we got a pretty good sample of responses, both from in-house teams and agencies, as well as a good representation across the world, including Europe, Asia, and the Americas. And those that are in the UK, who went through the last general election, will be very familiar with the concept of being very careful about interpreting polling and research. Very famously, all of the polling companies predicted the election result, and all of them got it wrong. And the lesson there is you should always be aware of the limitations of the research that's being used. And because we had, this was effectively a self-selecting survey, so people chose to respond to it, there will be a limitation to that. So what's likely to happen is there's likely to be a bias towards those in the industry that have more of an interest in measurement evaluation actually answering the survey. And that bias is also likely to extend to specific questions, as some of these 587 respondents did not answer certain questions. So there are some caveats. We should take some care in the interpretation of the numbers and to use our own experiences to interpret it. I should say that you can download the full survey from this easy-to-remember URL here, http://events.gorgana.com/LP=575. For those that can't remember that URL, and I can't blame you, we're going to email the link afterwards to everyone that's registered for the webinar. Also a reminder, any questions that people have, to use the hashtag AMECMM, and we'll be answering your questions later on. So in terms of some of the overall findings, well, the good news is that most communications professionals claim they use measurement. Here, one of our caveats needs to kick in. These numbers, if you look at the top left here, most professionals are focusing on what we call media outputs. So 81% of respondents said that they measured media outputs. What do we mean by that? Well, outputs are what's being outputted in the media, so the media coverage itself. And that's as opposed to the effect that that media coverage then has on the target audience, which we'll call outcomes. So you notice there's a big tendency towards measuring outputs rather than measuring outcomes. Now, given a significant number of people actually didn't respond to this one question, the 51% measuring outcomes is the people that responded to the question. If we take the number of people in the overall survey, that number comes down to 39%. And given that if you aren't measuring outcomes, you may be likely to want to not answer the question, then this probably is at the upper end of how many people are claiming to do it. But even so, you see a big difference between the number of people claiming they measure outputs and the number of people measuring outcomes, and even less linking that to the results of the business, or what the business or the organization is trying to do in the first place. And when it comes to measuring the business, the dominant business metric that is being tracked seems to be website traffic. That's the dominant business metric, and actually it's being measured more strongly in-house teams compared to agencies. So it's 71% compared to 64%. We'll come on to the reasons why this is likely later on. The next commonly used business metric is customer research, and really in two forms. One is in-house teams tending to focus on measuring customer satisfaction, while agencies tending to measure brand perceptions. And what isn't shown on this chart, but is quite an interesting finding, is that less than a third are measuring sales as part of the measurement program. So less than a third are linking their media relations back to actually the purpose of most commercial organizations, which is selling their products or services. What we found is that, and I think this links back to Jerome's point around the purpose of Measurement Month being to educate the industry, is that most PRs do not feel that there is enough knowledge and information on best practice available to them. Rather disconcertingly, awareness of some of the key pieces of work that AMEC's been involved in, such as the Barcelona Principles and the Values Metrics Framework, is low. Awareness is low. And I think that shows the need for updated and relaunched versions of both. And there's activity on both of those areas as part of Measurement Month. And it seems that there's confusion in the industry. Most respondents felt that there were too many metrics in the market and there should be a single recognized set of industry metrics. So overall, I think I see there's a sense of frustration here. The two main reasons you would probably want to justify investing in a measurement program are to prove the effectiveness of what you're doing, but also to improve the effectiveness of what you're doing, to feed it back into planning. And we can see there are challenges in both of these areas. So most PR professionals do not feel that they're able to demonstrate the overall impact of communications activity on business results. But also, most PR professionals do not feel that their measurement helps with future planning. And I think we can perhaps shed some light on this by drilling down a bit further. If we go back to those output metrics, I think this is interesting. If you look at what people are measuring, the output metrics themselves, so what's measuring the media coverage itself, tends to focus on measures of quantity, so volume and reach, rather than quality, such as identifying sentiment or understanding whether we're reaching our target key media titles to reach our key audiences. And again, slightly disconcertingly, AVEs are still being widely used. So a third of respondents admit to using the metric. Now, again, think about the likely bias here. That admit to using the metric. So the reality is likely to be higher than this. And actually, if you drill down and look at the difference between in-house and agencies, it seems that agencies, seems to have a particular challenge. 80% of respondents would like to do more sophisticated analysis, but there appear to be some significant barriers against this. Those stated tend to be time, resource for in-house teams, and cost for agencies. And finally, a quarter admit not having company or communications objectives. And again, let's think about the wording of that, admit to it, a quarter. The reality is likely to be a lot worse than this. So to explore, I've given you some of the findings, to explore the reasons for that, I'm now going to hand across town over the line to Ben, who will moderate our panel and explore what this means, both for measurement and the broader communications industry. Ben, over to you.
Thanks so much for that, Paul. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your questions so far, but please do keep them coming to us. The best way for us to get your questions is probably by using the hashtag on Twitter, which is hashtag AMECMM. But we'll crack on with some questions for our panel whilst you send those through. I think the first one that I wanted to cover off was the importance of, well, the stats that we've got so far are not, only a relatively few people are using outcome measurement within public relations, around 50% according to your research there, Paul. What are the main reasons for that, guys? Sarah, should we come to you first?
Yeah, sure. So I think it comes down to two things, actually, and I'll pick up on something that Paul mentioned that's also in the survey. I mean, if we're saying that 1 in 4 people can't actually define what the business objective is that they're working to, it becomes very, very hard then to track through the communications activity to a kind of meaningful outcome. So then people start relying on what they can count. And output measures are always things where you can produce big numbers quite quickly that impress internal clients or external clients if you're an agency. So I think it is about those two things, really. I think another issue, which doesn't necessarily come up in the survey, but it's certainly something that I've noticed, is capability as well. And I think what we're looking at across the industry is a need to kind of reformulate the kind of skills profiles of your PR and communications team as well. So for me, it comes down to those three things, I think, Ben.
Okay, and just exploring the objective things there. And if you don't have an objective for your campaign or the work you do, you clearly can't measure it, can you? So it seems odd that people apparently don't.
Yeah, I mean, it is odd, but I think it's very common, and I think, as Paul is saying, it's probably a lot more common than the survey actually indicates, essentially. The other thing I would say is that we shouldn't discount the value of measuring outputs altogether, because it is important to be able to look at the sort of tactical, how successful you are tactically as well. But it's just if that doesn't then follow on to an outcome, that's when it becomes problematic, I think.
Sure. Paul, have you got anything to add on that?
Yeah, I totally agree with Sarah on those points. I think the skill sets point is actually a really key one. I think if you look at where the industry has come from, it is, and you know, I'm guilty of this. This is my background. Businesses that make their money off of measuring media coverage, so measuring the outputs of media coverage. There is, and so it's not surprisingly that the skill set of the industry is based on that. And also, as Sarah points out, it's much easier to do, especially if you don't have communication objectives. Where I've seen success in linking outputs and outcomes, it's in combining skill sets. So it's in combining those people with the background of measuring outputs with market researchers, with data scientists, with people that are good at understanding what drives website traffic, for example, or econometricians, so people that are building models to understand sales based on multiple inputs. And I think there's a real need for not only the measurement industry, but also PR practitioners to work more collaboratively across their organizations so that they can work with people with those skill sets.
Okay. Jerome?
Well, maybe the situation in Holland is a little bit different from other markets. I'm not sure, but it also has to do in our market with the position of our clients. The PR communication departments are not always aligned enough with marketing and other sales departments to get access to the right data.
Okay, and we should be clear, just to follow up question on that output measurement, I should say. I mean, output measurements isn't easy, is it? We should be clear on that. It does mean that you need to dig fairly deeply into the organisation you're working for or with. It's not something you can necessarily, one size doesn't fit all, does it? So it does require some thought and some planning and some knowledge. Paul, do you want to just talk a bit about the complexities of output measurement just for a moment?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I noticed from this research was in delving down and looking at how those outputs are being measured, it seems that there's this focus on measuring quantity above quality. And going back to Sarah's original point, I think there's a tendency without understanding, if you don't know what your objectives are, then it's just a case of counting clips and saying, well, look, we've done a good job because we've generated a lot of coverage. And I think there's a reading I take from the research, and if I link to the point around that a lot of people that are attempting to measure are still frustrated by how it links back to planning, suggests that they're doing it wrong, which is that they're counting things that make it look good without actually getting any insight into what could be done better or to get learnings out from it. So I think if organizations really just thought about it and thought, well, what are we trying to achieve? What are the metrics that are aligned with what we're trying to achieve? There might just not be one metric. There quite often are many. And as one of the Barcelona principles states, that it's about measuring quality as well as quantity, and to have almost a balanced set of KPIs, then you're going to learn a lot more about what you're doing and what you can do to make it better in the future.
I think that point about the impressive numbers is a really key one, because I think when you're looking particularly at volume metrics, they can become quite seductive because they produce very impressive numbers. And if you're working with a client base who perhaps isn't the most informed or the most ambitious in terms of what it wants your communications to achieve, you know, waltzing into a room and saying, well, we've got 50 million opportunities to see in here, suddenly sounds very impressive. So often there aren't the incentives that you'd want in the marketplace for people to do things differently, particularly when it does involve an awful lot of thinking, an awful lot of planning, and an awful lot of resource.
Sure. Okay, just coming on to that link to that discussion, I guess, is one around coverage volume. It's still the most popular measurement KPI according to this research. I guess that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise, because media relations, quite rightly, remains a core part of any PR brief. But I'm just wondering, it should be part of a suite of tools, shouldn't it? And I just talk to us about how your clients and your team, Sarah, in your case, what suite of KPIs you use for the various campaigns that you do. Sarah, do you just want to talk about that first?
Yeah, I mean, for us it varies as to whether it's a kind of big behavioural change campaign run by an organisation like Public Health England, or something that's more reputationally based. And for the more reputationally based work, we use a combination. We do look at coverage volumes, but we link that back to the effect that it's having on public opinion. And the key thing there is how frequently you're testing that sort of more outcome measure on public opinion. And the more frequently you test it, the more you can actually see how well your actual tactics, so the volumes of coverage, where you've got that coverage, are actually impacting on your sort of sole outcome. So that's the approach that we would take in terms of reputational work, certainly. In terms of some of the kind of bigger behavioural change campaigns, we're using huge numbers of suites of metrics there, but I mean, we would certainly not be focusing on those kind of tactical volumes metrics for that. And in terms of those, I think people now expect to see that when we spend an awful lot of money on something like smoke-free, that we can then back that up with a really good return on investment in terms of how much money we're saving the NHS by reducing the number of people who are smoking.
Okay. Jerome, do you just want to talk about that briefly in terms of a suite of measurement KPIs that you see people be using?
Yes, I think in most cases our clients are interested in benchmarking on several variables. Volume is and will remain a very important one, but also when it comes to reputation, we use the red track model, and then you can benchmark on specific attributes to the reputation. But it's all very client specific.
Okay. A quick question via Twitter, I should say, from Sarah Baldwin. Any recommendations for key message analysis in media coverage? Who fancies that one? Paul, you haven't spoken for a while. What recommendations would you have for Sarah?
I think Sarah's picked on one of the most important metrics, certainly in my experience, you would tend to use. I mean, if you think about what communications is, it's about communicating a message to an audience and seeing if it resonates, or seeing what the response is. So if you don't have message analysis as part of your program, then it does make you think, well, what are you trying to measure? One of the challenges with messages, we've seen many examples where you have sort of a list of key messages and it's clearly come from the advertising department. Because IT companies tend to be, we're the leading solution provider, and no journalist on the planet is going to write that. So a big chunk of our time is taken up with really understanding what the message itself means. What are you trying to convey, and to interpret the inference of the message rather than word for word what it says. And in this age of increasingly automated measurement, I think that's a challenge, understanding the nuance and the sentiment of a message rather than just the words that are being used. Okay,
thank you. Just going to move on now to the next phase of the research, really, which was all around business goals. And one of the more surprising things that I thought came out of the research was that website traffic, with 68%, was the most popular KPI, I should say, for comms and PR teams. I should say that brand perception, so reputation, was closely followed at 40%, and sales at 32% were 2 and 3. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how simple or difficult it is, and I suppose whether it's becoming more difficult or more simple to isolate PR's impact into these business goals, assuming that people are working across integrated campaigns alongside marketing, advertising, direct mail, etc., etc. Sarah, can I just come to you first of all on that one, in terms of the difficulties of integrated campaigns? Although it's probably one that go on. You talk to us about how you guys measure integration.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really difficult one, and this for me was also a very surprising result, because it's not something that we usually have great store in, because the website traffic is obviously quite meaningless unless you know what that's actually converting into. I mean, for us, we might look at traffic, but we'd look at traffic in combination with, well, are we trying to get sign-ups to a particular email list to kind of develop, so we can sort of develop campaigns for the future? Are we then testing what people are taking away from that? So, I mean, I did find that quite puzzling, really. And again, I think I've come back to a point I made earlier, that these sort of figures that you can produce, and again, website traffic is another one where you can get kind of quite deductive numbers out of it quite simply, are kind of meaningless unless you know what they're actually linking to, unless you've got a clear idea of that at the very beginning of your campaign. So we would look at that, but with a whole range of other metrics, really.
Sure. But do you attempt to isolate the impact of public relations on the website stats or whatever else it might be, as opposed to advertising, for example?
Yes, we would, but it would depend very much on the kind of specifics of the campaign. And the fact is, we run such a range of different communications activity, and it would depend if we had a destination website as well, because increasingly government websites are very centralised. But for some, we do have specific campaign websites.
Fine. And in terms of, I mean, the practicalities of trying to isolate that, what type of techniques are there? And again, Sarah, Paul or Jerome, feel free to come in on this. What I guess a microsite is one practical element to it, but how does it work in day-to-day realities of trying to dig below the various different channels?
I mean, we'd look at it quite crudely, to be honest. We'd look at peaks in social media activity, we'd look at peaks in media coverage, and see if that was then leading to peaks in traffic, and then looking at the conversion rate from that traffic to whatever the outcome was. But I don't know, I mean, Paul, what would you...
Well, in fact, I would just want to make a couple of points here. One was on back to the website traffic point. I think one of the reasons it's very popular is that it's very tangible. It's easily measurable. I mean, as was pointed out earlier on, Sarah pointed out earlier on, being measurable doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it, but nonetheless it is measurable. I mean, an example we've had was we were working with UNICEF, and UNICEF, the two primary drivers UNICEF has is to try and get people to donate and to try and get people to support their activity, both of which are primarily done via their website. So it's clearly an important vehicle for them. And they try and integrate paid, owned, and earned media. So the earned media is supporting the owned media, which is the website traffic. So one of the things we're able to do is by looking at Google Analytics, you can see which types of media stories, particularly online and social media stories, are driving that traffic. So it becomes very tactical. It becomes, well, we need to do more of the stories that drive traffic and maybe do less of the stories that don't. The disaggregating the effect is kind of, I think, a very important point. While we're talking about integration, clearly, once you know, for example, that you have got, in the Department of Health case, you might have got fewer people smoking, or if you're a commercial organisation, you've sold more of your product. That's a tangible result, but then tying that back to the specific inputs, whether it's media coverage, whether it's marketing activity, whether it's the time of year, can be very hard. But nonetheless, there are increasingly within organizations, you're getting analytics teams, departments, econometrics specialists that build models that help explain an outcome through multiple inputs. And back to the skill sets point, these skill sets are there, they're not necessarily in our space. And I would encourage, where possible, to work with these individuals, because the incentives are there. These individuals are trying to model reality. They're trying to work out the best combination of effects that give an outcome. So we shouldn't be afraid to work with them to try and understand it for ourselves.
Okay. And Jerome?
I completely agree, but we have some experience with a very complex way of the scientific way to isolate the influence of free publicity for a Dutch beer brewer, and we build a model with all these variables, including the weather, which is very important for the sales of beer. But it became quite complex. We did some regression analysis, and it was difficult to perform, but even more difficult to interpret the results. So I think the only way to get really insights is to do it in a more pragmatical way and use your common sense.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to move on in a moment or two to talk about the future in terms of the various different modelling techniques that are being used and I think are being used more widely. But first of all, I just wanted to talk about a couple of other elements of this, and it's one you picked up earlier, Paul, about the need for education and information that public relations and communications people say they need about measurement. I just wonder what more can be done on that, because a cursory Google search, half an hour on AMEC's website, it really does tell you a great deal about what you need to know. So I'm starting to think that is it not, if people still aren't going out there and researching for that information, do we not get to the stage where it's in a sense their fault? What more can be done on that, do you think? Paul, do you fancy that?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So it's a really important question because we're at the beginning of measurement month. I think what's important for everyone to realise is that measurement month follows measurement week last year, and measurement week was the first event of its type.
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges AMEC has had is the fact that it's a global organisation, and the highlight of the year is the summit, the AMEC summit. And almost by definition, because you have a summit in one place, getting everyone into that one place becomes logistically challenging and expensive. So again, back to the whole point around self-selecting samples, you have people that are very engaged with analysis going to an AMEC summit. I think the problem we've got here is that we have part of the industry that's very, very engaged, many of my colleagues around the table, for example, and we have a big chunk of the industry, probably the much larger part of the industry, that isn't. So the challenge to us is how do we get the engaged lot engaging with the unengaged lot? And I think measurement month, stepping out on a limb here, I think it's probably more important than an AMEC summit because it is doing precisely that. It is reaching out to that broader audience. I think some of the findings around the awareness of things like the values matrix framework, the Barcelona principles are quite worrying, but we've got an opportunity. So on Thursday, we are relaunching the Barcelona principles. So I'd recommend everyone listening to this webinar not only to go to that event themselves or listen into that event, but tell all of your friends and colleagues to as well. I mean, I'm always amazed at how networked the PR industry is, and how if you make a friend with a client and they leave, then they'll bring you, they'll recommend you when they move to their other role in their new organisation. It's a very networked industry, so let's use that network to try and spread the word. I mean, let's get evangelical about it.
Okay. So, from an in-house perspective, do you agree with that? Anything to add?
I do agree. I mean, the one thing I'd add is, the AMEC Summit and people listening today are the really engaged people. I think what we need to bear in mind is what kind of culture these people then step back into when they're back in their organisations. And sometimes this is not a case of a lack of will among communications professionals. I think occasionally it is, but sometimes it's about do they have the power and the seat at the boards and the right kind of fit to their organisation to take their organisation on quite a profound cultural journey in terms of thinking very differently about communications and what communications can do. And in terms from the in-house team perspective, I think lots of, certainly in the public sector, organisations are in a very, very different place along that journey.
In terms of further ahead, do you think?
No, I think some of them, I think you'd find a mix, but I think it's not just educating the communications professionals, it's educating your internal clients as well, and having the confidence and the skills to do that, and also preferably some impressive outcome-based data so you can actually prove the value of having an in-house communications team.
Okay, so it needs a senior internal figurehead in a way
or to see it as a cultural journey as much as a technical journey, I think.
Okay. Jerome, anything to add on that?
I completely agree, but I also see a challenge to get education, universities involved more. I think there's also, in the Netherlands, there's also a lack of knowledge.
In what way get the universities involved? Do you mean getting them to talk to current public relations practitioners, or do you mean including more measurement in things like PR degrees?
Both. Okay. I think especially in the education of PR professionals on the universities, there should be more attention to the importance of evaluation.
Okay. Great. Just a quick question in from Twitter from Rob Pearson. It's targeted specifically at you, Sarah, but guys, feel free to come in as well. Best practice suggests that 5 to 10% of the fee is invested in your evaluation. In your experience, is this the case, Sarah? First.
Yes, I'd say certainly on our big paid-for campaigns, that's definitely the case. Internally, when we're doing non-paid-for work, the expectation among our teams is that they are spending 5 or 10% of their time on evaluation and in looking at how they're measuring the success of what they're doing. So, absolutely.
Okay. Paul,
Ben, can I come in? Yeah, can I come in on that? Yeah. I think that links into the
you're
point
people they could spend 50%, shouldn't you, on the
70%, surely. But there is this slight challenge, isn't there? That and the research shows this, that people see barriers to analysis as we don't have the resource or we don't have the money. And I think there is this perception that there is a finite pie of money and resource, that because our day job is doing media relations or doing PR, then that's what we should spend all of our pie on. If we don't spend it on that, then we're wasting it. Whereas, actually, if you spend enough time and resource on, or the right amount of time and resource on planning and on the measurement of what you've done, then it makes the doing part of it much more effective and efficient. And actually, there's an argument that if you do it well, then you can argue for a bigger pie. Anyway, so I think there's a bit of a, it's self-defeating by saying that we don't have the time and resource, because by definition that means you're never going to improve.
Sure. I was going to ask this a bit later on, but you've come on, you sort of brought it, it's a relevant question for now, Paul, so let's go for it. It seems to me the balance of measurement is changing a bit, isn't it? It used to be very much about backward looking, so therefore evaluation type activity, whereas now it should be anyway very much equally about looking forward from a planning perspective. And I just wondered if you guys felt that techniques were changing in recent years for planning, for evaluation to be, sorry, I should say measurement to be used more from a going forward planning perspective. Sarah, do you want to come on that one? And then I'll come over to you after that, Jerome.
Yeah, no, I think they definitely are, and I think there's certainly in the team that I work for, there's an increasing interest in thinking, okay, it's not good enough anymore just to describe yesterday's weather if we can't tell people what we're going to do tomorrow. Do we have all the data sources and all the techniques and skills to do that? Yeah, I'd say we're still, there's some way to go for us on that journey. But I do find the language very interesting around this. I mean, we keep coming back and talking about measurement. Well, I mean, I would rather we were talking about evaluation and not measurement, because measurement, again, implies to me that we're going back to counting stuff, which, again, is your description of the past, with your lovely deductive numbers. Whereas actually, if we're talking about evaluation, I mean, by definition, evaluation should be about predicting the future. But as I say, I think we've still got a way to go on that journey, and particularly getting into the more sophisticated techniques that are around there and looking at big data in particular. And I would say that's where we need to focus on the capability and the skills profile of our teams more.
Okay. Jerome?
Yes, I agree. We also see a need with clients for more actionable results to perform in the future. So in the early days we presented results afterwards, and now we're discussing findings during campaigns or during the work, and trying to see what the chances are in the future. So we integrate the results from media analysis in a news calendar. So we try to see what are the opportunities already know in the future by scanning the future news, and that's really exciting, and that's what the clients are looking for.
Okay, thanks. Paul, anything to add on that? Or?
Yeah, I was actually going to challenge you on the assumption that planning was relatively new. And the reason I was going to challenge you is that many people may not know this, but my background is that I was a physicist, and I'm the physicist's son of two physicists. So it's kind of in my blood. And science is all about, in fact, the scientific method is around having a theory, testing it, measuring it, and then feeding it back into the planning. It's that virtuous cycle of continuous improvement. Lord Kelvin said you can't manage what you don't measure. And the point around measurement being used for management, not just to show off and say, "This, I've done a good job," I think is absolutely fundamental. And it's a mindset. I mean, Sarah mentioned skill sets, I've mentioned skill sets, but I think it's not just a skill set, I think it's an attitude.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think if you look through all the stats we've looked at, really points to me that measurement, people are still doing it, but the motive is wrong. The reason they're doing it is because they want to say, "I've done a good job, haven't I? And here's the proof." Not, "I might learn something here that helps me improve what I'm doing."
Yeah.
And what I'd really love to see is for us to redo this in 2 years' time, and for the response to be, "Yes, I am getting benefit from this when I feed it back into my planning."
Yeah. I completely agree with what Paul said there about the attitude thing, because yes, there's a lot we need to do in terms of skills profile, in terms of certain technical skills and recruiting those into integrated teams, but curiosity is probably the biggest attribute we should be recruiting for. Basically, you want people who want to get behind the numbers as well as who have the skills to do so as well, and I think that's one of the most challenging things in terms of any kind of recruitment model, really.
Okay, great. I've got a few more questions from Twitter, so we'll just run through some of those if we may. First one is, do proxies and indicators have a part to play in measurement given the challenges identified in the discussions so far? Who fancies that one? Paul, quickly.
I would, but I don't really understand what that means.
Okay.
Sorry?
Okay, we'll move on to the next one, I think. How do you measure circulation? Okay, there's a nice practical point from a public relations perspective. What is the best approach, as this is what the board, this person's board anyway, is most interested in? I mean, there's things like publishers' statements, which are notoriously dodgy, and an ABC, which is Audited Bureau of Circulation over in the UK. But how interested are PR people in that type of data? Paul, I guess that's probably one for you as well, bearing in mind your background.
Yeah, I think it really depends on what you want to use it for. Circulation is the number of copies of a print newspaper. So it doesn't have a huge amount of resonance in if you've got a media relations program which is predominantly online, for example. It also isn't particularly relevant if you are a very niche B2B organization with a very specific target audience in mind. Where it can help is it gives you very broad brush mass consumer audiences if you feed it into kind of overall impressions or overall reach. So if you want those kind of volumetric, this is all the stuff we generated, very helpful. If you want to focus in on targeting specific audiences with specific messages, then it's less helpful.
Okay. Drew, we've got some questions coming in via Twitter now, so I just want to make this a more of a sort of quick run around of the panel. One question that's come in is, can media return on investment be used as a key metric, and can it be used to show value against a program budget? Do you fancy taking that one on?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
I didn't completely understand the question.
Can media return on investment be used as a key metric? Is the question.
I'm not sure what the return on.
Paul, do you fancy? It's a funny metric for me, I must admit, media return on investment. Paul, is that something you come across?
Well, I'm hoping this isn't directing us towards AVEs.
Right.
Because, I mean, the challenge, of course, is that as soon as someone says return on investment, then we either go down the route of going, well, what do you mean by that? What's the outcome you're trying to get to? And so, therefore, what benefit have we got? If it is trying to save lives, if it's the Department of Health, then that's your ultimate measure. If it's down to the, well, how much would this have cost if it was an advert, and that's my financial value, then I think AMEC has been very clear that AVEs are not the value of public relations. It'd be interesting to see if they still feature in Thursday's Barcelona Principles. But I mean, clearly there is greater and greater alignment that if you cannot equate media relations with advertising, and even if you do, it is not a measure of the return, the benefit you're getting as a result of the media coverage you're generating.
Okay, great. I'm keen to. I think we understand the AVE one, so let's take a tack away from there just for a moment. Another question that's come in terms of quantitative measures, what is the most important? Which I mean, I would have thought that just depends on what you're trying to measure. But Sarah, what's your experience with that at the Department of Health?
So again, it would vary on the kind of work we were doing. In terms of some of the behavioural change work, when we're trying to get people to be more physically active or not to smoke, ultimately the thing that we want to count is how successful those things are, and then we would then go through to count return on investment on that. On the more sort of reputation management side, it's the impact that we're having on public opinion, essentially, and those are the most important things for us and the most useful. We would always, in those circumstances, though, couple that with the kind of qualitative intelligence that we get from focus groups, various other testing that we do as well. And I don't think you can have one without the other, particularly on reputational work.
Sure. Okay. And finally, is there a minimum frequency for testing opinion? Who fancies that one? Go on. Yeah, go on, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say this is an industry standard, but I think if you are working on, I mean, for example, when we were doing the communications around Ebola, for us, polling less frequently than every 2 weeks made no sense for us because we were doing so much that we could not. If we did it less often, there's no way we could have tested the effectiveness of what we were doing, essentially.
Okay, great.
But I think it would vary very much depending on what you were doing.
Yeah, how fast moving the campaign is, or the story is, etc. Yeah. A question from Durgesh Garg in India. He works for a firm over there called Impact. His question is, how do you convince clients on costs in successful cases? Could we just, Paul, do you want to take that one, but from the perspective of, not just wider perspective than just a measurement provider, but also in terms of internal stakeholders as well?
Yeah, well, it goes back to that previous point around cost and growing the pie, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think one of the things, and almost going back to the education point, I think one of the things that we can do a lot more of is sharing best practice in terms of case studies. So nothing brings measurement to life like a story around an organization that's similar to yours, that has used measurement, and you can see the tangible benefits from it. So, I know that on the AMEC website there are more and more case studies going up, particularly the ones relating to this year's AMEC awards, previous year's AMEC awards. I think through official channels we should have more case studies, but also I think in terms of our evangelizing, our communications with people within the industry, it should all be about telling stories of organizations and how they benefited.
Okay, great. Right, guys, I think that's all the time. Oh, we're almost out of time, so what I think we'll do is we'll call time on the questions there, but I would just like to give each of the panelists 3 or 4 minutes each just to sort of summarize their thoughts in terms of measurement month, and also the best practice in terms of their own measurement techniques. Sarah, can I come to you first on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in terms of measurement month, the key moment, I know it's been mentioned, refresh and relaunch of the Barcelona Principles, and I think all our organisations need to be looking at that and looking at that in terms of setting direction for the industry, and we're certainly very excited about that and hoping there's that focus on objective setting, which comes to the point that we were making earlier, and starting your planning of the communications campaigns well. I think there does need to be a much bigger conversation about capability and skills profile. I know I've talked about it quite a lot today, but some of the things that we're saying is not just the technical skills are important, but the softer skills. We talked about curiosity. We also talked a lot about the role of professional leadership as well. I think in terms of our own experience as an in-house team, one of the most important things for us has been to have the confidence to try things out in terms of evaluation and to stop doing them when they're not working and to try other things. And the model that's worked for us most effectively is having metrics and evaluation techniques in place where we can see as near to real time as we possibly can the impact of what we're doing, particularly on more of the reputational work. So that will be my summary, and just to say, very excited to be part of Measurement Month, and for people to check out what's out there because it's a great program.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Paul, do you want to comment?
Sarah's stolen all my thunder there. This point around curiosity and attitude, I think, is fundamental. Building the skill sets, but also changing the attitude. I love the idea about working more closely with universities. In fact, Gorkana has invested quite a lot of time recently with developing analysis parts of PR courses. I think that's fundamental in terms of setting up the future. This point around using the scientific method. It's amazing what the case studies that really resonate with me are the ones where people fail, where things go wrong, and learning from it. If you get a chance, go and look at the UNICEF session that was at AMEC in Stockholm. This concept that was used, Paloma, head of communication concept, fail fast. So in other words, don't be afraid to experiment. If things go wrong, that's fine, but learn quickly and adjust. And I'd love to see this change in attitude from trying to prove how good we are to learning what works and learning what doesn't.
Great. And Jerome, just to finish off the panel session, any thoughts from yourself?
Well, I think one of our biggest challenges is to get our clients, the internal stakeholders of organizations aboard. And I think Measurement Month could be an excellent way of doing that by organizing events with clients. And actually, this afternoon we will have a session at our office with some clients, and I think that's the way of going forward.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, panelists. That's it for this part of this this webinar. Now I'll just hand over back to Jerome, who's going to just talk us through some of the details for the rest of AMEC's Measurement Month. Thanks so much, guys. Jerome, over to you.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the close of the launch event. I would like to thank you, Ben, for facilitating, and Sarah Gibbons and Paul Hendler for being part of the panel. Thank you all for listening. There were more than 100 participants. Thank you very much. I hope you found it interesting. And I encourage you to join in AMEC events throughout the rest of the month via webinars, tweet chats, events, executive discussions, workshops, which are taking place all around the world. Starting this week in Europe, next week Asia Pacific, and last week in the third week in North America, and the last week with global events. Information about how to register is available on the AMEC website. There's a link on your screen. Well, that's all for now. Thank you very much.
I got a quick text from Barry Legater, AMEC Czar, who's told me to make sure to encourage all of our listeners to register for the free breakfast event, which is in London, where the new look Barcelona principles will be unveiled. And I'm told all the booking details are on AMEC's Measurement Month calendar. So if you haven't already done that, then please do so.
That's on Thursday.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you very much.